South Dakota has long been recognized as among the most conservative states in the nation. I've been there a lot. Love to hunt pheasant up there, actually. It's a beautiful state. But the left has used powerful business interests to really buy South Dakota away from its conservative heritage, at least some of its political leaders, when it comes to the radical transgender policies. And let me just say, we're going to have a conversation with a reporter that's been investigating this. I actually have some personal experience in working on policy up there and scratching my head as to why certain bills that simply protected children from experimental surgeries and hormones that could harm their bodies was dying in the legislature, being blocked. Well, a lot more came to light in a deeply reported article in the National Review last week, which outlines a well-funded campaign that has pushed gender ideology into almost every area of the state's governing institutions. And starting tomorrow, the Sanford Research Center in Sioux Falls will host the third annual Midwest Gender Identity Summit, which is billed as an effort to review the needs of transgender patients in healthcare. Now, how did this happen in cherry red South Dakota? And is the Mount Rushmore state merely a trial run to bring these policies to every red state in America? Join me now to discuss this is the author of the piece, Nate Hochman. He is a staff writer for National Review. Nate, welcome to Washington Watch.
Hey, Tony, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so tell us what you uncovered in your reporting on South Dakota. I mean, how in the world did this conservative small state, become a hub for transgender politics?
Right. So South Dakota, just to reinforce the point you're making, is one of the most conservative states in the country. By ideological polling, South Dakotans are the third most conservative population in the United States. They've been governed by Republican supermajorities for decades, but almost every single conservative transgender bill, including a lot of the kinds of transgender bills that we've seen introduced in a lot of other states, bans on men and women's sports, bans on sex change surgeries for young children, et cetera, has died in South Dakota over the course of the last decade in their heavily Republican legislature. And I dug into that and found that a large part of the story about why that is because the largest employer in the state, Sanford Health, profits from puberty blockers and sex change surgeries and has a very close relationship with the South Dakota GOP and its leaders. And as a result, even though South Dakota
Nate, let me stop you right there, because a relationship. Now, I'm interested in this because our policy arm worked with legislation there to protect minors from these experimental surgeries, our SAFE Act, and sailed through the House, and then it kind of died in a committee over in the Senate. And as you said, people need to know, you have controlling Republican majorities in the state legislature, as well as a Republican governor who holds herself out to be conservative. So this connection, what is the connection? Is it a monetary connection? Is it a philosophical, ideological? What's the connection?
I think it's a combination of all those factors and more, but I think it's impossible to understate or to overstate how powerful Sanford Health is in South Dakota. It's a $7.5 billion company. It's the largest employer by a degree of 7 in South Dakota. And they fund the campaigns of a lot of Republican leaders in the state, including a bunch of the Republicans who sit on the Senate Health and Human Service Committee, which is the committee that killed the bill you're talking about, the ban on sex change surgeries for minors.
So when you say they fund their campaigns, I mean, are these $50 contributions? What are they?
No, they're often upwards of multiple thousands every campaign cycle, which may not sound like a lot to those of us at the national level.
Well, not in South Dakota. I mean, that's one of the smallest populations in the United States. I mean, I would love to run statewide in South Dakota because they only have like 2 media markets, and it's just the population is not very large.
Exactly. And that's why a company as powerful as this $7.5 billion healthcare company is just the most powerful institution in the state. It can throw its weight around, and it can elect a lot of Republicans that won't get in its way, particularly on this radical gender ideology stuff.
What's their relationship with Governor Kristi Noem, who is potentially a candidate for the consideration for Republicans in 2024?
Well, look, unfortunately, because Kristi Noem really did emerge in 2020 as someone that a lot of conservatives were big fans of, she has a very close relationship with Sanford Health. It's her top career donor. She's very close with a lot of Sanford lobbyists. And she vetoed actually a ban on men and women's sports, which is legislation we've seen in other red states across the country.
Yeah, that was very interesting because actually South Dakota was one of the, I think, like maybe the second or third state to entertain that. She vetoed it, and then of course it just swept the country and all these states. And then she came back the next year as if it were her idea and pushed a sports bill through. Isn't that right?
No, that's exactly right. And she did that because she got a massive backlash from conservatives, including a lot of conservatives who used to be her fans. But I reported on it at the time, and I had multiple sources in her office telling me stories about how they saw Sanford lobbyists, including some of her very close advisors, come in and tell her that she had to kill the bill because Sanford is opposed to it.
Now, Sanford Health, you said they're the largest employer in the state. How large?
Well, the number of employees that Sanford Health employs is almost 7 times larger than the second largest employer in South Dakota. I don't have the exact number, but it is by far the largest company in the state. And it also has some employees who work in the South Dakota legislature as registered Republicans.
And then they also have a large, I would almost say based on what I've heard, oversized influence with the Chamber of Commerce, the business community. Because of their size, they control a lot of what the Chamber of Commerce, which is usually not good anyway. But we're talking about measures, Nate, that, as you talk about women's sports, I mean, that's a no-brainer. Almost every state that's even pink has embraced that. But then we're talking about this experimental surgeries that are being done on children, often irreversible, and now more and more evidence coming to the forefront that, of course, across the sea in Europe, England, other places, kind of pulling back on this, saying, hey, we got to slow this down. And so many states, Arkansas, other states have pursued this. It's dying in South Dakota. It all goes.
That's right.
And it all goes back to this outsized influence of this business entity.
Yeah, I mean, the country of Sweden completely banned this stuff, which is supposed to be a sort of progressive utopia. But in South Dakota, cherry red South Dakota, it won't happen because Sanford Health lobbyists show up in the state legislature every time the actual social conservatives in the state legislature try to pass something like that. And this particular bill, which they tried to pass in 2020, a ban on the chemical castration or surgical mutilation of South Dakotans under the age of 16, was again killed in the Senate Health and Human Services Committee by a lot of legislators whose top career donor was healthcare lobby groups like Sanford and who were closely linked.
Now, has Sanford, they've actually supported, they've supported people on their committee, on the committees they work with. Have they opposed candidates that are opposed to their agenda?
Not only that, but they've actually dumped a really significant amount of money into efforts to primary all of the actual conservatives in the state legislature who got in their way. And they had, unfortunately, the backing of a lot of the South Dakota Republican establishment, including Kristi Noem, in that endeavor. One of their allies, who is the president of the Senate, Lee Schoenbeck, actually circulated a hit list of about 20 conservative legislators who had been the ones pushing stuff like the ban on the chemical castration of minors. And Sanford Health has funneled really hundreds of thousands of dollars into the campaign to actually unseat those conservatives.
So Nate, you've written a number of articles. There's been other national articles that have been written about this. In South Dakota, is this well known?
No, and in fact, I have been inundated with emails and messages from sort of normal run-of-the-mill conservative South Dakotans saying that we had no idea that this was happening in our state and that we're horrified. Again, South Dakotans are a good, solid, conservative people. This does not represent their interests or their views, but because a lot of it has been sort of happening sort of under clandestine circumstances, and the Republicans who lead the state aren't broadcasting that they're doing this, the average South Dakotan often isn't aware. And I think they would be horrified, and they are horrified when they find out that it is.
So Nate, this conference that's taking place or that begins tomorrow, what that Sanford is behind, what will be the focus of this conference?
Well, it claims to be a sort of gathering for transgender medical specialists. So that includes, sort of quote unquote gender identity experts and sort of psychotherapists who work with gender confused people and children, and also some actual transgender surgeons who a lot of whom are associated with Sanford, who actually perform sex change surgeries and sort of irreversible drug-induced sex changes on people, including children in the state. And it's a gathering of all of those people together in Sioux Falls.
All right, so we've got Sanford that has been killing legislation that would protect children and, kind of be against the whole transgender agenda. But what are we seeing in state government from a proactive standpoint of actually pushing this agenda? I mean, it's one thing to try to stop conservatives, but are they actually working within the ranks of government in South Dakota to advance this leftist agenda?
Yes. And one thing that I found through a lot of digging through old sort of legislative hearing files is that Sanford lobbyists show up often literally in lab coats to effectively lobby against a lot of these bills. They're on the record as testifying and lobbying against things like the ban on the chemical castration of children. And they've lobbied against a variety of other social conservative bills, almost all of which have died. And on top of that, there are registered Sanford lobbyists who currently also serve as elected lawmakers in the state legislature. So they're lobbying.
Wait a minute. You have paid individuals from Sanford that are legislators?
Not just paid individuals, but paid lobbyists whose specific payment is to lobby the legislature. They are also elected lawmakers because it's a sort of part-time job in South Dakota, which to me seems like an enormous conflict of interest.
Do they recuse themselves from voting on issues that are of interest to Sanford?
Not only do they not recuse themselves, but they actually actively champion the efforts to kill a lot of these bills.
That's incredible. Yes. I mean, you talk about an ethics issue. That's essentially Sanford Health is buying up legislative seats that they're putting their employees in. Obviously, if you voted against your employer, your full-time job could be gone.
Exactly. And I looked into it, and the salaries they're making from Sanford Health, unsurprisingly, are 4 or 5 times larger.
I was a legislator. They don't make a lot of money. It's a part-time job. But I'm stunned. Frankly, I am stunned that is able to take place there in South Dakota, and the people there would tolerate that.
Right. Well, like I said, I think South Dakotans are a very good, decent, conservative, heavily Christian people. And I don't think they'd tolerate it if they were actually aware of exactly the extent to which it was going on. But, South Dakotans, I think, do not deserve the really milquetoast Republicans that often claim to represent them. And I hope they draw a bright red line in the sand about this stuff and hold them accountable.
All right. Nate Hochman, thank you. It's shocking. I'm almost speechless with some of the stuff that you've shared with us. Thanks so much for joining us. A great piece. I'm going to have a link on it at tonyperkins.com. It's a lengthy piece, and I would encourage people to look at it.
Thanks so much for having me, Tony. I appreciate it.